Well, hello and welcome to Anthony's Rewind, a show about going back and seeing if things really hold up. I think we've all had that conversation, right? Where we look back and we say, these are our favorite movies of all time. This is my favorite movie of all time. And we always talk about them, but when was the last time we actually watched them? Based off a conversation I had a few months ago with a friend of mine that lives in California, we were talking about our top 10 favorite movies of all time. And going through them, we were discussing them, and then the question arose, well, when was the last time you watched it? And I started going through my top 10 favorite films of all time, and some of those movies I hadn't seen in a really long time. And then it rose, are these movies really holding up? Is this movie even the same as it once was? Does this film really have the value to me now? As we grow and as we become different people in the world, does this movie really generate the same feelings as it did once before? Has this movie developed even more feelings, or is it maybe something that we just don't, relate to anymore? And I thought it was really simple to start off with movies that I know that I really love. And I think one of them in general that I really love is Quentin Tarantino movies. He's my favorite director of all time. He's really easy to follow. He still has movies that are relevant, that are coming out. And I just felt like that was a simple way of doing this, going through the Quentin Tarantino films. To me, I've seen all of his films a bunch of times, but realistically, I haven't watched them recently in a really long time. And his first film he ever put out, which was Reservoir Dogs, which is the movie we're discussing today, has always been in the conversation of my favorite film of all time. And, I hadn't watched it probably since 2004. So this is the first time that I watched it. And let me tell you what I'm doing differently now than what I do with this film in general than I do differently when I watch a movie now anyway. So if I'm watching Netflix, which I think we're spoiled on, I put on a movie, and I'll typically play on my phone, or I'll goof off or do whatever, answer phone calls, do whatever I need to do. I don't really give the film as much time as it needs to be. Hell, I'm even that person in a movie theater sometimes. If my phone goes off, I'll even look at it just because my attention span just isn't there. And I think that's because, we basically are walking around with a computer at all times, and it's just easy to get lost in that. So this is what I'm doing with this series. It's really simple. I am going to watch for the first films, these Quentin Tarantino films, I'm going to watch them completely uninterrupted. I'm not going to watch them with a smartphone. I'm not going to have a laptop in front of my face. I'm going to watch it 100% digging into it completely uninterrupted. And then I'm going to give you my opinion about it and see if it holds up. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I put out a list of what I think my top 10 or 9 movies are in order of what I think they are based off of my recollection of the Quentin Tarantino films. And what I did was I just kind of went through a list and said, all right, well, I remember this, I like this, I do this, and kind of see where they are then. And from that list, this is where my list stands today. I have number 1 as Reservoir Dogs. For my going back and remembering that film in general, I just remember being awed the entire time. I just remember loving that movie. I remember the first time I actually watched that movie. It was in the mid-'90s. I actually rented the film from the library and just fell in love with that film tremendously. Number 2 is Kill Bill 1 and 2. That movie was originally supposed to be one long film. Miramax is the one who cut that up. But Kill Bill 1 and 2 really sparked my love of Quentin Tarantino again and made me dig deeper back into his history. And I just loved Uma Thurman in it. And it was something that I just was like, you know what? This is an amazing movie. And one other movie that I watched a bunch back in the day, but I haven't probably watched that in, 10 years? Death Proof is number 3. That movie I feel is very underrated. Inglourious Basterds number 4. Pulp Fiction number 5. Jackie Brown number 6. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood at number 7. Django Unchained at 8. And 9, The Hateful Eight. Now this is where the list stands before I started watching these movies. I've only watched Reservoir Dogs now, and we're going to be doing these in order as Quentin Tarantino put them out. So I'm going to be watching those in the order of which they came out and putting this out weekly. So I did it this week with Reservoir Dogs, and I'm going to tell you something. I was a little surprised by some things. There's a lot of things about it that really stood out to me off the bat. One, when you watch this movie, you can easily see the early workings of the beautiful mind that Quentin Tarantino has. You can see that he was using a very low budget type film. I mean, it's not high end. It's not the same budget he has for the films that have come out recently, but you can see he's doing things in this movie that you're gonna see down the road in a Pulp Fiction or a Kill Bill. The way the films are shot, the way that they're done, it is done in a way that he is getting. You're seeing the early workings of Quentin Tarantino, and that is really cool in its own sense. Because realistically, this film, the way it was put out, first of all, the fact that is the first film by any director is crazy to think that way. But the fact that it's given you the early, like, this is what we're gonna get, and it's only gonna get better, that's pretty awesome. The other thing that really stood out to me is, could this movie be made now and be accepted? And I don't know. I think there'd have to be some real significant changes based off the way the world is nowadays to see this movie really work. And what I mean by this is there's definitely use of language, and that not unfortunately, but just the way the world is nowadays, there's things that we just don't say anymore. And there's quite an abundance of language in this film that unfortunately we just cannot use anymore. And I'm not saying unfortunately like, oh, I wish we could use it. Just that this film is beautiful in its own way, but right now this film cannot be made again today unless you remove certain words and some actions that I think that would make it done differently. But this film is really a bridging of a genre that was done differently. This is very much a cop film, like an action film, but you're seeing it in the eyes of a villain. So, I mean, back in the day, there were so many movies coming out in the late 90s. This film came out in 1992, early 90s, late 80s, that were just so driven by the fact of these cop movies, Beverly Hills Cops. And, you talk about all those movies where, Pierce Brosnan and all these different films are coming out that, that were absorbed. And this was such a different film that you're seeing on the eyes of this villainous side. And this film really, depending on how you look at it, is who is the lead person in this movie, because you could say it's Harvey Keitel. It's him going through this whole aspect of him being in the warehouse. Is it Mr. Orange? Is it Mr. White? Is it Mr. Brown? There's so many different stories that are being told in this film that it leaves you to find out who you want it to be about. And that's what's interesting. The movie really does start open with, this really great line that really stands out to like the test of time. And it has Steve Buscemi in this movie, which Steve Buscemi, really jolts his career after this film, going down a long, long list of fantastic films, and his acting is absolutely amazing. But this movie has so many great one-liners and so much great speech and so much great writing. Like I said, it's amazing watching this and getting the idea that this was Quentin Tarantino's first film. But one thing that was pretty awesome and I love about this is this line right here.
Come on, throw in a buck.
I don't tip.
You don't tip?
No, I don't believe in it. I don't tip because society says I have to. All right, I'll tip if somebody really deserves it, but it's tipping automatically. It's for the birds. When I order coffee, I want it filled 6 times. Jesus Christ, these ladies aren't starving to death. They make minimum wage.
It's funny because you listen to this, right? And there's what I love about, first of all, Quentin Tarantino, and I saw it immediately in this film, and it brought me back to why I love him as a director, is the way he writes movies, it feels natural. The way that these actors are talking about things and the way these actors are even describing things or even their conversations, it feels natural. A lot of times when you're watching movies, things feel forced and it doesn't feel, it feels like almost like a Hallmark movie. This, everything that everyone's saying and everyone's talking about, you feel like you're in the room during a conversation. You're really a part of it. And that's when things just like, you get locked in. And it was so easy for me not to have my phone during this movie. It was so easy for me to follow along, and this movie just flew right by, honestly. And, the scene really opens up right quickly with a conversation. Quentin Tarantino talking about Like a Virgin and his adaptation of what Like a Virgin's about, and this conversation of gentlemen around a table, and they're all about to go and do this heist. And the movie really, in the grand scheme of things, only takes place in a few scenes, and the scenes are short, and then the majority of the movie is taking place in a warehouse, which is crazy to think that a movie that can hold your attention for so long is filmed majorly, I'd say 70% of the movie is taking place in a warehouse. And you're not seeing a whole lot of, changes in the warehouse. You get a maybe of motion and things, but it's so crazy when you look at this and you're like, wow, this film is done with minimal scenes, minimal camera angle shot changes, and it's all done basically by dialogue and acting. That is what this film is about, and this is how it grabs you. And it's crazy because the movie jumps around a lot too, which is, in its own sense crazy, because you really do got to follow along, because if you don't, then you get lost in what's going on. When you're talking about having, two actors, when you're having Harvey Keitel and Tim Roth, Mr. Orange and Mr. White in a warehouse, and you have, Tim Roth's character, who's shot, and what's going on, how'd this happen? And then Mr. White's talking to him, and you have this scene of him in a car. And first of all, that's another thing that blew my mind, and this is the great side of Quentin Tarantino. Tim Roth's character is shot, and he is in the back of this car that you find out later on is stolen, and it's white leather seats. And you're talking about Mr. Orange bleeding out, and his blood is everywhere. And it's that bright red, extreme blood, which we know is just, it's just vividly seen. And the way that this shot, the contrast between the white leather and him bleeding out, just makes it that much more impactful. The scene is just that much more driven. And having Javier Keitel's character talk about, hey, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. You can see that there is a buildup of friendship there in that short period of time. And it just makes this whole movie build up even more. And it's just fantastic. And the acting is just crazy. And then, of course, you go to the warehouse, and they have all of these different scenes, and then they bring back characters, and you start finding out, Mr. Brown dies, and then you find out that, they're in a shootout, he gets shot in the head, and then you start finding out that you start building up all these things. Mr. Pink is the first character, kind of comes back into it. Stevie Buscemi does an excellent job of this, and this is something that really stood out too, and this is where we start seeing things that give you clips of what we're going to see more of and down in the road in more films. There's this scene where you have Mr. White and Mr. Orange are on the ground. Mr. Orange is told Mr. White, can you hold me? They're holding each other. They're talking. Mr. Pink walks through the door. He asks what's going on. But the way it's shot, it's crazy. And anytime they show Steve Buscemi's character, they're showing you an angle as if you're looking up from him from the ground. And it gives you a different perspective. This is something you don't see in film at this time. And then when Steve Buscemi's character is done talking, and then you have Harvey Keitel's character talking, you're seeing almost an angle of looking downward at Harvey Keitel. And this is where things are interesting, and it keeps you really entertained, because once again, you're seeing this difference in the way a film's being done, and the difference between the camera angles, the dialogue, and this scene alone just grabs your attention, because it feels like you're there in a part of the movie, and this is where things are different, and this was fantastic. As the movie gets on, you start finding out more about the characters and the build-up and stuff, and I find that really interesting. I think Michael Madison's character, Mr. Blonde, which is interesting because I didn't know this previous to watching this. I did some history and did some research in the movie. I didn't realize that this movie tied into Pulp Fiction at all. I didn't realize that this Mr. Blonde's character is actually John Travolta's character's brother in this Quentin Tarantino world, which is totally over my head. It shocked me because I thought I was a big Tarantino, fan, and finding this out was shocking to me. But it's cool to know that there's these tie-ins. This was interesting because as Mr. Blonde is introduced, you start learning more about Mr. Blonde and the fact that he has this alliance to Nice Guy Eddie and Joe, and you start finding out how these characters have come along. And then it kind of makes you think, like, well, is Mr. Blonde the lead character? Because, now you're getting more history about him and how he got involved in the heist, and then it goes back and it explains to you Mr. White and how he got involved in the heist, and then it talks about Mr. Orange. And I think the shocking thing to me was, like, if you're watching this for the first time and didn't know Mr. Orange was a cop, and then you find out because you have this buildup in the beginning of the movie of this relationship between Mr. White and Mr. Orange, and Mr. White feeling nervous about things, and then you find out Mr. Orange is a cop, you're like, oh my God. And then, the scene as the movie builds on, and you find out Mr. Blonde had actually taken one of the cops during the heist, because the heist had gone to shit, and then now you have this cop in the trunk, which is another dynamic scene that was, it's crazy because once again, this is something that this movie holds up to its own sense because it has so many crazy scenes that really are memorable, and this is one of them. You have Mr. Blonde opening the trunk of the car that he had heisted, and then in the back is the cop, and they bring him into the warehouse where you have Mr. Orange bleeding out, and you have Mr. Pink, you have Mr. Blonde, and you have Mr. White with the cop, and you have Mr. Orange who's passed out, bleeding to death off to the side. And once again, we're still only in one scene, this warehouse, but they're using it in different ways to make it feel bigger and larger than life. And this is another way of looking at how the use of camera angles and dialogue changes everything. We get to it as they get, they're torturing the cop and stuff of that. Mr. Blonde says, "Nice guy Eddie's coming," changes the scene up. You start to add characters, and then characters leave. And then the famous scene happens where Mr. Blonde is torturing the cop and cuts off his ear. But this is something that I appreciate about this movie. And this is where Tarantino changes things up as movies goes along. It's an implied action during this scene. This is why I love 70s horror and even horror of back in the day compared to what it is now. When Mr. Blonde goes to cut off the cop's ear, the camera angle goes to the left. You do not see the cop getting his ear cut off, but once everything is done, you see Mr. Blonde with the ear in his hand, and he jokingly talking about it in his ear, and then you see the action of what the ear cut off, but you never see it actually being done. It implies it. And it's done so well, because sometimes I feel like Tarantino in newer films goes so overboard with some of the actions of it. It takes away from it a little bit. I don't need to see all the gory details to know what's going on. I think leaving your mind open to things is what makes a scene so impactful and really puts you on the edge of your seat. And, at this point, there was a lot of conversations that were dropped. By this point in the movie, there's a lot of conversations where the N-word was dropped constantly. And this just kind of made me feel uncomfortable because, I don't know, there was just a lot of, and listen, I know it's of the time back then. I guess it was appropriate to utilize it. I mean, in 92, I was only 7 years old, so I don't really remember, but I don't recall it ever being appropriate. But anyway, I know it's just a movie, and these people talking about it don't really mean it, but it's constantly being used. And then they use like all other words for, calling someone, if they were gay, a word. There was a couple times I just felt uncomfortable. Like, I don't really need this, whatever. But back then it's different. This is 30 years ago. Shit was talked about differently 30 years ago than it was now. But realistically, at this point, you're still built into the movie. As characters leave and things start getting built up, you start seeing flashbacks of how things get built up, how the heist happens, why the heist falls apart. And the dialogue is what carries the film consistently throughout the entire movie, this point of the movie. As we get along, there is definitely feelings of nervousness of when are they going to find out that Mr. Orange is a cop? When is this all going to happen? Because, it is crazy. And, Mr. Orange ends up killing Mr. Blonde and things start happening. I'm not here to give you a synopsis of the entire film. I'm just here to give you an idea of what's going on in the film, the things that stood out to me, and go from there. One line that I took tremendously from this, and this was when Mr. Blonde is talking to Mr. White and they're going back and forth. Mr. Blonde says this line, and it's really good.
Are you gonna bark all day, little doggy, or are you gonna bite?
There's small lines like this that hold up because, I remember hearing that so much back in the 90s where people talking, shit to each other, and then people were saying things like, are you going to bark? And then you're going to bite? Whatever. Lines like this stand the test of time. This movie clearly stood the test of time. And it was interesting to me, like, how well it stood up. It really has so many memorable scenes. There's, One of the other memorable scenes is when Mr. Pink and Mr. White have the gun exchange, and there's that look of them exchanging each other from the floor as Mr. Pink's on the floor and Mr. White's looking over him. There's just so much going on in this film that really just stands out. One thing about this movie that I think is rather interesting, too, as you look at it, is the psychology of the actors in general and how they were utilized in this film. A lot of movies, you have actors being built up one at a time, and then they introduce another one. So you basically are learning about somebody, then they add other characters, you learn about them, you add other characters, and then it builds up, and then that's how the storyline's built. The way that this was done was they keep adding information about the characters. You had all the characters up front. They keep adding all this information, and then you, as the consumer of this film, are building up of who are you supporting and who you're following. For me, when I watched this film, I felt relatively closer to Mr. White. Mr. White, I felt like was, even though one of the villains in this movie, I felt like watching it through his eyes, because you get this feeling of he feels bad about Mr. Orange being shot. He wants to get him help, but he also doesn't want to get himself in trouble. But he doesn't want him to die. And you have this, he has this like father ability to him that he's like trying to comfort Mr. Orange as he's dying. He's also the one that's protecting him from Mr. Pink and Mr. Blonde. And, I've heard people that say they felt Mr. Blonde was the lead character, and I can see that. And I've heard people that say Mr. Pink was the lead character, and I can see that as well. Mr. Orange does have a real good, strong way of thinking and could potentially be the lead character's film. But for me, it was Mr. White. And I think the most true scene to the entire film is the last scene of the entire movie. The entire time you finally have Joe who comes in and says that, after a while he comes in and says, hey, Mr. Orange is the cop. I know it. And then you have that scene where he's about to kill him. Mr. White pulls up his gun, points to Mr. Orange. Mr. Orange and then you have Mr. White who puts the gun to Joe, and then you have, nice guy Eddie pointing the gun to Mr. White, and it's this nervous scene of what's going to happen. And then finally, because Mr. White at this time doesn't know that Mr. Orange is a cop, and then the shots go off, and the guns go everywhere. Everyone's shot. You have Mr. White going over to Mr. Orange as if he's his savior. The cops break into the warehouse, and Mr. Orange announces to Mr. White that he's a cop. And what does he do? Well, that's another implied scene, because the gun goes off as Mr. White has a gun to Mr. Orange's head, but that doesn't show you anything. It only leaves you open to imagination. And it leaves you with the sign. Mr. Pink does flee, and there's gunfire. We don't know what happens, because as Mr. Pink is leaving, as he says that he stashed a diamond somewhere, and he leaves the place, there's gunfire, there's cops going off, so we don't know what happens to Mr. Pink. We all assume he dies. It was another implied scene, but that's what's so cool about this movie. There's so much to leave the consumer, the viewer, the watcher, like what you want to get out of this movie, and that's what's really cool about it. And that's what I loved about it. And it made me think back to now, is this my favorite movie of all time? Is it a top 10 movie of all time? Have I seen movies that are better than this? Yes, I've seen movies that are better than this. Does it hold up better than some of those movies? It's tough to say. We always change our mind about things, but I will do this. I gave it a rating based off a few factors. Once again, does it keep my attention? 100% keep my attention the entire time. Is the cast fantastic? 100%. This cast had Harvey Keitel, Tim Roth, Michael Madison, Chris Penn, Steve Buscemi, Lawrence Tierney. You had Kirk Blatz, who was playing the cop who got tortured. And then you had Edward Bunker and Quentin Tarantino himself. And that cast alone has done so much after this film. So much. Had such careers. I mean, the story of how Quentin Tarantino got Harvey Keitel to even play Mr. White is interesting, because it was just getting a script out and Harvey Keitel reading this and wanting me a part of this. And, Tim Roth and Michael Madsen, they all had huge careers and were so successful out of this. So that was huge. The music of the movie, the soundtrack's fantastic. Having the entire film, you'd have those, those quick clips that went back to K-Billy.
KBILLY, home of rock.
This whole constant connection to the movie and the radio station was so well done, and the soundtrack is fantastic. And listen, Quentin Tarantino is a genius about how he would utilize sound to make scenes cool. The introduction of the characters as they walk out of the diner, and they're going off to the heist, and that really cool sound with them walking slowly just made them badasses. And the torture scene, with the music, everything that was done in a way that it was done beautifully. It was a painted picture of this Picasso-esque piece that was done so elegantly and so well done. And the way it was filmed, is this Quentin Tarantino's best filmed movie? No, not by a landslide. But I will say this was a great introduction to what we're going to get. There's still things that he did well in this movie that was done so much better than other directors of its time. The way that it was able to capture true emotion and raw intention, and the way that it was able to capture conversations and dialogue so well that everything was formulated into this one big thing, done beautifully. And does it hold up? This is where I feel that it potentially loses points for me. Like I said, once again, there's dialogue in this movie that easily cannot be done nowadays. There is some ways that it was shot nowadays that I just don't think that for the average movie goer, if this movie came out today just by itself as Reservoir Dogs by any other director, I don't know if people would love it as much nowadays, because the attention span of people, everyone would be like, it's only shot in one area. It is what it is. I don't think it holds up as much. And that's why it becomes some sort of a deduction on points. But here's the thing. Realistically, it's still a fantastic film. This movie is going to be talked about for years to come. It's a 30-year-old movie coming out 30 years from this year, 30 years ago, 1992, which is crazy to think that was 30 years ago, but 30 years ago. And it's so perfect still. So on a scale of 1 to 10, I gave Reservoir Dogs an 8.2. And once again, I don't know if I would have given this a 10, 15, 16, 17 years ago. It's not a perfect film by any means, but it's still a fantastic piece of work. So this is the first of the series. We have upcoming the next film, which is going to be Pulp Fiction, which is going to be coming out next week. And we're going to see, does that movie still work, or does it not work? Does that fit in? The fact that also that this is going to be like they tie into each other. Like I just now found out about that, how Mr. Vega is, tied into John Travolta's character, that they're brothers. And then there's also some more theories about how the diamonds from this movie are actually tied into Pulp Fiction. There's so much into it, and that's what keeps me interested. Now I'm excited about this. So this week I will be digging into that one and putting it out. But I would say if you've never seen this film, and I just ruined most of it, still watch it. It's definitely a great movie to watch, and I still think the acting is fantastic. It gives you an early view of what Quentin Tarantino is going to become. So, all right, that's that. So until next time, I'm Anthony. This is Anthony's Rewind. Reservoir Dogs 8.2. Next week, Pulp Fiction. Till next time, thanks so much. Give us a like, give us a subscribe. I don't know how this shit works, and